Hey y'all, so after we've learned the overall concepts of functional programming and started to get into the syntax with arrow functions, now we really get into it. This is really the core of functional programming in a lot of ways. This notion of higher order functions. And if you remember this slide from earlier, that seemed kind of weirdly symbolic in nature. Um, this sort of a function is going to make a lot more sense, I think, after this video. Um, and so, in order to understand what's happening here, we have to understand what this means. This is a statement you'll hear a lot when trying to understand functional programming in JavaScript. You'll see this all over the intertubes. Functions are first-class citizens in JavaScript. Well, what does this mean? Um, it's pretty simple, you know. It just means functions are fully capable in JavaScript. Functions can act like any other variable. So functions can be stored in variable names, right? Which we know. Um, functions can be passed into functions, as we have already seen, right? With set interval and onClick. Um, and that's an example of a higher order function, right? Is when you're passing a function into a function. Functions can also be returned from functions. So if we look again at that previous slide, we'll see a function is being returned from the outermost function. And you know, this is almost purposefully, playfully goofy and 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 maybe obtuse. Like all good Dadaist jokes. But you know, we'll look at some more, you know, concrete versions of that in a sec. First of all, though, you know, right, functions can be stored in variables. Yeah, we know that. Functions can be passed into functions, right, as we were doing before. And they can be passed in as in immediately invoked functions as well, right? Um, Now, as we get to this last, functions can be returned from functions, right? And I want to just pause before we get there and look a little more at functions being passed into functions and how that's useful, right? So we saw set interval, but here we can take a function like this, right? That's actually doing two things. This function repeat log is logging out a value repetitively. So this is, you could see this almost as like a refactoring of what we were doing before with say my name. But this one's going to log for a specific number of times, n times. It'll log out the number. But let's maybe take that those if we take those two different functionalities and make them separate functions, we can combine those functions in interesting ways, right? And so here, instead of just logging a value, we perform a more generalized action n number of times. So we're extending the capability of our function from our previous video to not just log every time, but to do anything we pass in. And I hope you can see immediately how that's more powerful and useful, right? And this is how we get rid of code smells in our code, is we try to think this way. We try to create functions that are generalizable, functions that are composable, functions that we can combine in interesting ways. And so, you know, if there's one thing you take away from these videos, it's that, to try to create these small atomic functions that you can combine in interesting ways and that don't have a lot of intermeshed dependencies or inheritances, but just do things. And that we create a powerful, useful, and bug-free program by keeping our functions small, specific, and combinable and composable. And so here we've got this repeat function, and it takes in n, and it also takes in a function, and it does that thing. And so here we're drawing on that ability for functions to be passed in to other functions, just like variables. And another example of that that's maybe a little more, let's say, useful, right, is we can call that repeat function and give it an n, number of times, and pass in this arrow function that's going to push a value derived from the index to the labels array. Make sense? I hope it does. If not, again, just take your time and come back to this, or ask me questions in the Discord. Now, what we've got here is called a side effect. And we'll come back to side effects in a bit. But I just want to draw some attention to that is actually something called a side effect. And, just some general guidelines for composing with functions. Functions should do one thing. Functions should generally have inputs. They should have return values. And when they don't, and sometimes even when they do, that it's likely that we're dealing with a side effect. And we'll come back to side effects. Side effects are considered dangerous, but they're also unavoidable. And so, again, this function doesn't return anything here. It simply pushes a value to a global variable, right? Which is can get tricky. So something to keep an eye on for sure. All right, so now I'll return to this question of side effects at the end and come back to those guidelines again. But I want to talk about another thing. So this last and stickiest and trickiest and funnest aspect of higher order functions is this notion that, or this practice of returning functions from functions. And so here we see an example of composing with functions that you're probably pretty familiar with. You've got some food, and you pass that food into your cook and eat function, and your cook and eat function returns a new function, right? Which is made up of two other pre-existing functions. One that's going to cook the food, and then after it's cooked, you'll eat it. So this new function can be called cook and eat. And I hope that makes sense, you know, kind of instinctively, intuitively. Um, and hopefully these last examples will also make sense. These are some tricky concepts. So I wouldn't be surprised if I'm not doing a good job explaining them. And if I'm not, I apologize. Um, I can heartily recommend both JavaScript Allonge and Eloquent Javascript from the very first video. I mentioned them, and they're in the description for all these videos as more extended resources. But you can see in this slide here an example of something known as currying. And currying, this curry is creating something in a way not unlike that last video. What we're doing is we're taking this function called add, which has two inputs, right? If we add 5 and 4 here, we should get 9. And we can do this in the browser window. I'm going to just make a new window. And we can look at some of these concepts in actual action. So I'm going to make, I'm not sure if I called it sum before, but sum is going to take two values, A and B, and it's going to return the sum. Right? And so I'm going to call sum with 5 and 4, and predictably we get 9. Now I can curry this function and get the same result. And I'm going to call that curried sum. And curried sum is going to be equal to A. So it takes A as an input, and it returns a function. And this function is going to take B as an input, and it's going to return A plus B. Oops, not blur, just B. And so now we can call curried sum, which we know wants one value. And curried sum is going to return a function. Neat, huh? So if we then want to invoke that function, we'll add on 2 more parentheses. So I'll say curried sum of 5, and then pass in 4. And we get that same value. And so we can also, do this in steps. I can say const curry1 equals curried sum 5. And I'll say curry step 1 and pass in 4. And we get 9 again. And so this is a syntax you'll see a fair bit in React, and in Regal, you see it right off the bat when you declare your Regal instance. And this is a very powerful, useful, and kind of neat aspect of working in JavaScript. Now, why would we want to do this, I think, could be a question. Why would we want to take those 2 input parameters and turn them into just 1, right? And the reason is the more simple, pure, and atomic we can make our functions, the better. And that's something that you really just got to experience in real life, I think, in order to really feel the utility and power of that. But try it out with your own functions, and it may take a year or 2 or 5 to really get to the place where you're feeling like it's you understand it well enough to be able to really use it, but hopefully it won't. Um, I know it took me a couple of years to wrap my head around these concepts, and part of that I think was because the resources that I had at my disposal weren't helping me. So that's what I'm trying to do with these videos, is be helpful for people that are just beginning this journey. It's hard stuff, but if you just slow down, I think it'll make sense, and just try using it. And so currying is um, related to this notion of partial application. Um, and partial application, in currying, we're um, really always trying to end up with just one. We're trying to reduce the input arguments, parameters to just one value. And we do that so that we can create these composable atomic functions that are very modular. Partial application is related to that. In partial application, we strip off one of those values, maybe, or two, to create other modular bits that may take more than one input. And so these are terms you'll hear a lot. Again, what I'm hoping is that in this context, you can see these for what they are, which is fairly straightforward and simple ideas at their core. And we'll see these in action, for instance, when we get to array.reduce. So here's an example of a partial application where we can have a function to determine the volume of some 3D primitive, right? And it'll be length times width times height. But if we want to have a consistent length, we can make a new function by stripping off one of those values and making a new function called volume 70 or volume 30 or volume 125, whatever the case may be. In this case, we're making volume 70 by passing in that 70, and then later on executing the complete function. And I hope that helps a little bit. Certainly, you'll see this type of syntax quite a bit. As I said, in both React and Regal. You don't have to be a master of it, but I think when you see this in the wild, knowing that what's happening is a curry or a partial application, my hope is it'll be helpful to have this knowledge to draw on. And so again, functions should do one thing. That's one of the core concepts of functional programming that is going to be broken all the time, right? We've seen even in these simple functions, these functions often do more than one thing. But that's just a sort of guiding principle. Try to write, if you need to do 5 things, write several different functions. If you need to do very different actions to some data, break it down into multiple functions, and you can use currying and partial application to help with that if you need to. Functions should generally have inputs, so the data we use inside the function should be passed into the function. Try not to take your data from a global scope. Functions should have a return value. And so this is, and if we do this, if we make sure our functions have a return value and we structure our code like this, we will, of necessity, have fewer side effects. And if functions don't have return values, or if you're, purposefully writing a side effect, just be careful with that. And maybe put that in a specific part of your code base that is for the impure. And so we saw already a side effect here, right? Where we've got this anytime you've got a let variable, there's a good chance there's a side effect lurking somewhere around, which is another reason to always default to using const whenever possible, because you can't mutate a const. Your interpreter will help you out by complaining and saying, no, you can't change that. And so this is a side effect, and this came out of Eloquent JavaScript. It was an example in Eloquent JavaScript. So, it's not like we all work with side effects all the time, and we just try to be extra careful when we are doing so. And honestly, anytime you draw something onto the screen or log something to the console, you are a side effect to achieve that. So, side effects are, in a way, very desirable if you're a creative coder. And these side effects are exactly why React and Regal exist. When the developers of Regal say that Regal is a declarative library that helps you manage state, that's what they're trying to say is this is a library written in a declarative style that aims to abstract away your tendency to create mutating side effects and make them easier to handle. And the same with React. The main reason React exists is because when Facebook was scaling up in users and introducing new features, they started to have all kinds of weird side effects and bugs creeping in. And they realized that the tools and libraries they had at their disposal were not working for them to track those bugs down. They just couldn't handle the amount of interaction that was happening between users and their data. And so, I hope all these videos helped a little bit, are helping. I'll come back in the next video and start talking about array methods, which are some of the key tools for writing declarative and functional JavaScript. And these methods came into JavaScript from the world of functional programming. So I'll see you in that one.